Okay, good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me on this mic? Yes, very good. Well, thank you all so much for coming this evening to this excellent program. My name is Peter Gerlach, and I am the Executive Director of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council. I am also a Professor of International Studies here at the University of Iowa. And on behalf of our organization, ICFRC, we're very proud to partner in conversations just like this one. Our work for the last almost 42 years has centered around bringing community members together with community partners in an effort to increase knowledge about, interest in, and conversation about what's happening around the world. I think tonight you'll find this to be a particularly interesting conversation that is global in nature. That is, we'll be talking about international examples as well as those right here at home in Iowa. With that, let me turn it over to Corey, who will help introduce and carry the conversation forward. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good evening, everyone. My name is Corey Dunlock. I'm the Curator of African Art at the Stanley Museum of Art and Director of the African Studies program here at the University of Iowa. So thank you again for being here this evening. I'd like to start by sharing the fact that I used to begin my introductions here on campus with the University of Iowa Acknowledgement of Land and Sovereignty. State law and executive order have recently forced the removal of this acknowledgement from all official websites from the University of Iowa. And I want to call attention to this absence as we gather to learn from the leaders involved in restitution and repatriation in Iowa, and the way institutions in Iowa work with cultural heritage collections. Welcome to the Mellon Symposium on Museum Ethics and Provenance Research. Tonight's program, Reclaiming Heritage Leadership in Restitution and Repatriation in Iowa, is the first in a 3-day series of events. I hope you will all join us tomorrow at the Stanley Museum at 2 p.m. for presentations from the Stanley Museum's Mellon team for Provenance Research, and at the museum again on Saturday at 2 p.m. for Mellon Symposium keynote lecture by Dr. Suraj Rasool. Support for this evening includes a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and at the University of Iowa, sponsorship from international programs and the Museum Futures Working Group at the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies. I also want to thank Peter Gerlach again, Executive Director for the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council and Assistant Professor of Instruction and International Studies here at Iowa, for approaching the Stanley Museum with the original idea for a program about the Stanley Museum's recent restitution of deaccessioned objects to the Oba of Benin. After additional meetings with Peter, Stanley Museum Director Lauren Lessing, Curator of Learning and Engagement Ken Dachuk, the idea quickly evolved to become the symposium we have now, and which features scholars who work directly with collections at the University of Iowa, Meskwaki Cultural Center and Museum, and beyond. Thank you again to Peter and the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council for the invitation to join together for this program. And thank you to Mavish Farid, I don't know if Mavish is with us this evening, Communication and Marketing Coordinator at the Stanley Museum, for her excellent promotional work for the program this evening. I want to thank our panelists for participating tonight, identified as followed, and will present in this order. Jonathan Buffalo, Historical Preservation Director at the Meskwaki Cultural Center and Museum. Lara Noldner, Bioarchaeology Director at the Office of the State Archaeologist at the University of Iowa. Cindy Opitz, Director of Research Collections, University of Iowa Museum of Natural History. And Peju Layiwola, Mellon Curatorial Fellow at the Stanley Museum of Art. I also want to thank my co-moderator this evening, Suraj Rasool, Senior Professor of Historical Studies and Director of the African Program in Museum and Heritage Studies at University of the Western Cape, South Africa. Again, please be sure to join us at the Stanley on Saturday at 2 for his keynote lecture. After each of the 10 to 15 minute presentations this evening, Suraj and I will co-moderate a 15-minute discussion with the panelists, and offer another 15 minutes for Q&A with the audience. We have a total of 90 minutes this evening, and the doors close at 8. So let's go ahead and welcome our first speaker, Jonathan Buffalo.
Hello, can you hear me? Well, my name is Jonathan Buffalo. I'm the Historic Preservation Director for the Meskwaki tribe, and I have been working on repatriation since 1993, when the tribes began receiving summary letters. So they hired me, and I'm still there. And in the 30 years I've been doing this, I've learned a couple of things. One of the things is museums will fight over one little thing to a big thing, but they'll fight. Some are easy fights, some are hard fights. But the process is long. It's mentally challenging because they demand documentation. They demand that I prove that we have the right to have it back. So it's a lot of research. And these objects were collected in 1890s to 1930s for us from who we call headhunters, people that were hired to go collect from a tribe and from hobbyists. And these accumulated in museums, in state and out of state. And one thing I've learned is with museums, and I'm talking about none out of state museums. Iowa State Museums know us very well. So I'm not talking about Iowa museums, I'm talking about the farther you go, it gets worse. That the museum holding, even if they hold hundreds of objects, they don't know the tribe. And they're being held because of the collector. They're known to be the collection of so-and-so. That's where the importance of the object is for them. It's the collector, but not the tribe. Because they may display our artifacts, our stuff, but they don't tell anything about us. Doesn't teach anybody. You can go to our little museum on settlement, and you can learn anything you want about the tribe in a little space, smaller than this room. So, and when these people collected, they told a story. They told our story, because museums believe they have a right to tell our story. For instance, and each collector had a story about an artifact. This was their sacred water bottle. Seems like everything was sacred for a while until Nashville came along and everything is, oh, that's just a spoon. That's just a wooden bowl. That's just this. But for one thing, in one particular museum, I visited, I was looking at their collection that was on display before I went down the basement to see the rest of it. But I saw a stick, and they called it a medicine stick. And I knew what it was. It was a fort that Mamishi is a ceremonial cook. And that's the stick that Mamishis would cook the meat, like chicken or duck, or pork house. Would stick it and put it in a spoon, bigger spoon, and dish it out. And when I was a boy, just starting to be a Mamishi myself, that stick was this big. Over time, during the day of the ceremony, us young boys would be scraping and clean for the day. So eventually it became this one, and it was retired. And next thing I know, it's in a museum, being a medicine stick. And I did not dispute their identification. I didn't say, oh, that's a fork. No, because then they would have been just a fork. So I left it being a medicine stick, just in case if I had to use that. So that's how we deal with stuff when we talk to museums of our artifacts. The identifications the collectors gave them, sometimes we have to fight. We have to fight the museum, and then we have to fight the collector. And that's a long process of arguing with collectors that is worthy of being returned. So, working with museums. The first thing I think of is museums have a bad institutional memory. They're real terrible of institutional memory. And if a new person is replaced, I practically have to start all over. Because that person requests a letter from my chairman to know that they're dealing with the right person. So I have to get a new letter. And I finally asked one museum, I have a file on you. I know everything about you. Because I Googled you. My Google was starting to be available. Said I know a lot. Plus our regular communication. You should have a file on me. You should have a file on the tribe. So that the original letter is valid still, but that never changed. But it's not all been bad. There's been good relationships, especially with Iowa, my own state's museum. Has always been good. And the most successful story that I can relate is bear claw necklaces. Because we had a council of 10, and each councilman had a bear claw necklace. And when they met, that was part of their badge of office. So there should be 10. So, about 10 years ago, we started getting calls from our collector friends. We're going to do a bear claw necklace. That's Sotheby's by Chief Pushkonico. And we said, in another Meskwaki that helps me collect, we said, we should go ask the council if we can get some money for it. And I told them, no, they're going to say no, because it was worth $40,000, $70,000. But he kept bugging me, and I said, okay, we'll go to the council. And they said yes. So he said, we'll give you a ceiling of 100,000. So we said, so we went bid on it. Started at 40,000. We went down, and it started going up real quick. And we were watching it on the computer, and auctioneer kept saying, oh, Frenchman, eventually it was just us, the phone, which was us, and the Frenchman. Phone Frenchman. And we, if you know our history, we fought a war with the French. So we weren't going to let this French guy take our telephone. Besides, if it went to France, it would disappear. So we kept on bidding until it came to 70,000, and the Frenchman quit. Because we're not thinking of reselling it, but our competitors, we knew our competitors are thinking of their profit margin. So we got it. And after that, it seems like the other ones popped up. My attention popped up to those other ones. And I started repatriating them. And quite easy in Iowa. But as I went farther out, it got harder. And I still doing those things because they're really fighting hard. And one necklace, a family member, one particular family, it was sold from another family. But one family member told me that was actually ours, my family's necklace. But my grandfather died and remarried this man, and their mother didn't give it to the oldest son for something. So this man, the next husband, started wearing it, and the family thought they owned it. So I thought, according to the law, that's not right. So I went to the museum, told them, I'm going to repatriate that necklace, and I'm going to get it. And we can do it easy or hard, depends on you, but I'm going to get it. That was my card in my pocket. So, but then they repatriated real easy. So I've got 6. I don't think I'm going to get the 4 because they're probably lost. But those represent our sovereignty and our governance. And me and my wife were talking here. We were talking of what I was going to say, and once I stood up, I forgot half of it. That's why she's sitting there. So, later on, you'll probably ask me questions, but thank you for listening.
Hello, I'm Lara Noldner. I'm the Bioarchaeology Director for the University of Iowa's Office of State Archaeologist. And I'll just refer to that as the OSA from now on, since that's a mouthful. But my position at the OSA is basically for repatriation and seeing to our office's statutory responsibilities for the reburial of ancestors' remains, that ancient human remains and their burial property, which here in Iowa means both native and non-native individuals. Not sure how many of you know, but Iowa was one of the first states to have burial laws, if not the first. 1976 is when our burial laws were passed, and they were very forward-thinking in that, and set the precedent for federal law, NAGPRA, Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, because they required that we have a system for reburial, and they required that we have an advisory council of Native people. So very early on, we were already consulting and already arranging reburials. The first reburials were in 1977. So all these pictures up here are kind of the path of my program, but this is not even the half of it. I feel like every time I give a lecture or talk on repatriation, it always just involves a lot of pictures of people. And it's because there's a lot of people that go into building relationships that have to happen before repatriation can happen. So in the bottom left corner was the very start. That was the 1976 passage of the burial laws. On the far left in that picture is Maria Pearson, the bottom left corner. Yankton Sioux, she was the one that actually marched into Governor Ray's office there in the Sioux to demand that the discriminatory treatment of ancient human remains, especially Native people here in Iowa, cease. And right next to Governor Ray is Don Wanatee, Jonathan's father-in-law, and Suzanne Wanatee, Buffalo's dad. So the founders of the burial laws and the foundation of essentially our program at the OSA as well. My predecessor, Dr. Shirley Shermer, was the only one before me, so I'm the second in line in this program, and just very honored and to be taking on this path. Jonathan mentioned that it's easy here in Iowa, and it's because of all this long-standing program and all the relationships that were built up even before NEG, right? Before 1990, when museums were forced to report all that they had. And so the top left corner is a more recent iteration of our Indian Advisory Council, and just a representation of our kind of just routine consultation that has to go into not just repatriations or burials, but just kind of governing all that my program and that the OSA does in our work. So as you may have gathered, my side of this conversation is from the museum collections, especially human remains and artifacts that are both funerary but also sacred, that fall under NAGPRA. And so my primary responsibility is towards that part of our office. And then the bottom right picture is a more recent event that we've had. So I feel like we've had a very strong pathway for the repatriation of human remains and definitely funerary objects. But we had a lot more to do kind of in these last few years, just with going through all of the OSA's collections and making sure that tribes are aware of what we have and what they can claim if they wish. So we basically did a whole survey of our collections and had a consultation event here at the OSA to let tribes review what we have and always welcome that kind of work whenever people want to have it happen. We were kind of asked to kind of give a timeline of our thinking on repatriation, and so kind of quickly I'll wrap up with that early on in my career in bioarchaeology, as a very naive new grad student, I was thinking, oh, I can, just work with collections and not really have to talk to anybody. But I quickly learned in the very first year of my career that that's not how it goes. And that I feel like it was just, I got to work on a NAGPRA repatriation or documentation and consultation grant with the University of New Mexico's Maxwell Museum. And that's really where I really was just thrown into the deep end on NAGPRA and how this has to go. So I quickly learned the deeper meaning of really understanding the context of collections, their history of collection, whether that was sanctioned or not, mostly not, and how that is, how their acquisition history has affected and still affects Native and Indigenous communities today. And just, since then, just have built on that experience and value the relationship that value the relationship building and communication that has to happen for repatriations and anything, not even NAGPRA, but collections related. I feel like, collections were often taken where Native people were removed from. So there was no one to tell anybody different. And so people just kind of collected at will, not really appreciating the people and the heritage that those collections represent. So I think my underlying thinking for this symposium was just to really value and just the cultural heritage that the collections that we take care of represent. And I think that we have a long way to go with really bringing that to the forefront and really making students and museum professionals aware and immersed in that kind of thinking. But I think I'll leave it there, and I'll welcome questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. I love what you said about repatriation being about relationships and about people. I'm Cindy Opitz. I'm Director of Research Collections at the University of Iowa Museum of Natural History and Old Capitol Museum. I'm in my 27th year at the museum, and I've seen some repatriation work personally, but I'm fortunate that my predecessors did most of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm fortunate that they were forward-thinking, and they were quick to embrace repatriation when it became law, and quick to educate upper administrators about the importance of returning items that really don't belong in museums. So as Lara mentioned, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act is a law that was enacted by Congress in 1990. It covers Native American human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony in museum collections, and it provides a path for restoring these items to tribes and lineal descendants. So why repatriate? Not only is it the law, but it is the right and respectful thing to do. Our current ethical lens acknowledges that some past collecting practices were wrong, disrespectful, and hurtful to Native peoples. Restitution rights some of these wrongs. Returning items to individuals also puts nations and descendants in control of their own heritage. And restored items can provide insight into traditional arts and opportunities to revive old techniques and pass them on to youth and build communities. Academic museums like ours have a responsibility to lead and teach by our example. In 1993, the Museum of Natural History repatriated a Zuni war god known as a Haida from an unknown collector in the 1880s is when it came to the museum. Former director George Schrimper read a museum news article in the journal Museum News in 1991. Well, the article was from 1991. I'm not sure exactly when he read it, but when he did, he saw something. He saw images of items that were being repatriated by the Museum of New Mexico, was facilitating exchanges of these items. And he saw that he had one in his own collections at the museum. So he contacted Dwayne Anderson, who was the former state archaeologist of Iowa, and who at the time had moved out to New Mexico and was the director of the Indian Arts Research Center. And Dwayne Anderson put him in touch with Zuni members. Governor Lewis of the Zuni Pueblo agreed to receive the Zuni war god that we had in the collections at the Museum of New Mexico. There was a ceremony at the museum, after which a private second ceremony occurred before the sacred object could be taken into tribal land. In 1994, the Museum of Natural History returned Dene individuals. These were skeletal remains. They had been collected by student explorer Frank Russell, who was up in the Arctic and subarctic region, collecting animal specimens, cultural objects, interacting with native peoples, but he also listened to stories around the campfire, and after everyone went to bed, dug up human remains. In 1992, George Schrimper contacted his dean here at the University of Iowa, and then in early 1993, the Canadian consulate in Chicago, to say that he intended to repatriate these skeletal remains. It was just simply not right to keep them. His query was forwarded to the Canadian Museum of Civilization, which agreed to receive them on behalf of the Dene people. Shirley Shermer, who Lara mentioned as her predecessor at the Office of the State Archaeologist, identified 21 full and partial individuals in her report on them in 1993. The remains were returned in summer 1994. It took a while to figure out the logistics of sending human remains across international borders. Russell also purchased a caribou skin lodge for $25 from Bear Lake Chief Kawaida at Fort Ray in 1892 during his trip. He used that lodge throughout his travels. It was made from over 30 caribou hides, and it was the last caribou skin lodge known to exist in the 1990s. Charles Arnold of the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre heard an interview about the return of the skeletal remains to Canada and contacted George Schrimper to ask if he could have this lodge, as it was the only known physical example of a caribou skin lodge left. June Helm, who was working with the Dene people and the Heritage Center, facilitated communications between the Dene people, the museum, and the museum here in Iowa. A transfer ceremony for the lodge was held in the Old Capitol in April 1997, after which the lodge was displayed at the Heritage Center in Yellowknife in 1998, and the exhibition was opened with a ceremony, prayer, feast, and dance. Director Schrimper also shared photos of other items for a Canadian Cultural Heritage website. After Kawaida's lodge was returned, Dene elders and youth worked together to create 2 new lodges based on that original. The men and young boys hunted caribou, and the women and young girls processed the hides, so younger generations were taught these traditional methods. In 2000, one lodge replaced the original at the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Center, and one was exhibited at an elementary school in Ray, Northwest Territories. The QR code here on the screen links to a video about the Dene People's Community Project. It's a long one, we're not going to play it here, but I encourage you all to watch it. In 2015, the Museum of Natural History returned the Meskwaki bear claw necklace that Jonathan Buffalo has mentioned. It was gifted to the museum in 1983 by the daughters of the late Fred Armstrong Solomon for display in the Iowa Hall exhibit gallery. We're not aware of who the original maker were or when it was created. As Jonathan mentioned, it was worn by tribal leaders in government as symbols of authority and sovereignty. In February 2015, Jonathan Buffalo identified the necklace as an object of cultural patrimony and requested its return. Former Director Trina Roberts and I published an intent to repatriate in the Federal Register, which is one of the steps for repatriating under the NAGPRA law. When no other claims were made during the required waiting period, the necklace was transferred in September 2015 and welcomed back in a private ceremony. Repatriation is an ongoing project, or an ongoing process. The Office of the State Archaeologist has recalled several batches of loaned items from Iowa Hall displays, and now we're at the point where we need to redo our displays and rethink how we're displaying things. Also, as we research and digitize our collection data, we find additional items that should be returned, like the pot and pipe cataloged in 1892 in this image. We're currently working with the Choctaw and Quapaw nations on these items, and also finalizing inventory of several funerary objects for Canadian tribes. Thank you for coming out today.
Thank you very much. My presentation will focus on the recent return of two objects to the honor of Benin by the Stanley Museum of Art on the 15th of July, 2024. These culturally significant objects were part of thousands of treasures violently looted from the royal palace in Benin during a siege carried out by British soldiers and commercial agents in 1897. 6 of these objects eventually entered the Stanley Museum collection. These are the images of 2 of the objects that were returned: a wooden altar piece known as Iyohoho, and a brass plaque known as Ama. I must add that the Stanley Museum obtained the permission of the reigning monarch, Oba Ewa II, to share these images. The Oba also has a list and photographs of the remaining 4 objects in the collection. So, what do these objects mean? The hen is a sacred object usually kept on the altar in honor of maternal ancestors. It is a metaphor for nurture, particularly in reference to the hen defending its young ones against predators. And hens are slaughtered for sacrifice in the ritual of the head. It is an ornately carved figure taken from a single piece of wood. The plumage of the hen is represented with geometric patterns, and on the top of the hen, you find a form that holds a wooden or iron tusk. And this tusk are carved narrative scenes that document the history of the kingdom. The brass plaque depicts a high-ranking palace functionary wearing a woven hat. He also has a beaded sash over his shoulder, and he holds a ceremonial sword known as Ete in one hand. And he also wears a hip mask, which has a leopard face, which is a royal symbol. These 2 objects, made in 2 different media, are in recognition of the ingenuity and skills of the low class man divided into guilds. And so the brass plaque was made by the guild of the most important guild in Benin, known as Ikoemu. And the other one, the hen, was made by the guild known as Ibisama. The process of restitution began with Provenance research on the Benin objects in 2020. Currently, the Curator of African Art have hired a Provenance research assistant who is seated here, Mr. Cole, to work together with him to trace the ownership history of the Benin objects. They were able to obtain extensive documentation to confirm definitively that 2 out of the 6 objects were part of the siege of 1897. Unfortunately, not the same level of details could be obtained for the remaining 4 objects. So what do we know about the life history of the objects? 2 main dealers were involved in the sale of the objects after the siege: William Downing Webster, a British art dealer, and Harwich Bay and Company, also known as Bay and Zimmer, a German trading firm based in Lagos with offices in Saple and Warri, which is not too far from Benin. Webster acquired many Benin objects directly from British soldiers and commercial agents, while Henry Bay was actively shipping valuable resources such as palm kernel and looted cultural materials from Lagos to Hamburg. Both dealers were directly complicit in the circulation of looted Benin objects. The hen was bought by Max Stanley in 1978, and the plaque was purchased by the museum in 2001. So how do I connect to this remarkable story of this return? I was born in Benin City into a family with deep ties to its history, and there's my mother and her father. As an artist, I have been involved in advocacy for the return of looted Benin art, using my work to engage with themes of restitution and memory. My connection to the Stanley Museum of Art began in 2022 when Corey invited me to speak on a panel about museum interventions at the Symposium of African Art Studies, and this was online. My engagement with Benin art began with a solo exhibition which I held in 2010, which was followed by further projects in 2014 in Benin City, and in 2018 in South Africa in Grahamstown. And one of the most impactful experiences was working as a co-curator of 2 exhibitions at the Roughton Strategies Museum in Cologne, working with a collection of 96 looted objects which had hardly been shown to the public for several decades. My artistic intervention helped draw significant attention to the collection, contributing to the momentum that led to some of the first official returns of Benin objects to Nigeria by the German government. It was also the first time I physically touched a Benin object, an experience so profound that it inspired me to write a poem which was performed several times in Cologne and later during the official standard restitution ceremony in Benin. When I resumed my fellowship in January 2024, the accessioning of the Benin object had already been completed in 2022, and the plan for their return to Nigeria was underway. However, the museum needed a direct link to the Benin Royal Court. In addition to conducting provenance research on the Stanley Museum's African collection, my role became pivotal in facilitating the necessary connections to bring the restitution process to fruition. I introduced Corey to Prince Agatise Edeawa, the Oba of Benin's brother and cultural representative. Over several months, Corey and I held a series of discussions with the Prince, gradually shaping and finalizing plans for the return. It was a careful, collaborative process that ultimately brought this important effort to completion. The Stanley Museum of Art was exemplary in its approach, and that is a photograph of the return by the German cultural minister in Abuja. Okay, so the Stanley Museum of Art was exemplary in its approach. It was true to its intentions and chose to follow a unique path in returning the objects. The decision to return the objects directly to the king was solely theirs. Throughout the handling of this process, the museum showed a great deal of transparency and a deep sense of respect for the community. This was truly an eyeball-to-eyeball process. Each step of the way showed uncommon sensitivity. At the palace, where Corey made a public apology for using the objects as teaching resources without the king's permission, a hush fell on the palace ground. The Stanley Museum may not have been the first to conduct provenance research on colonial-era objects, but it has clearly proven itself as a leader in ethical stewardship. The return was, I think we should clap for the Stanley Museum. The return was made directly to the king, Oba Ewa II, who is a descendant of Oba Overall, the king exiled by the British in 1897, who died in exile in 1914, and it was also carried out in the very place that was sacked, in the same palace that was sacked in 1897. So, while we were preparing for the trip, it was teamwork at all levels. The collection team did not attach any stickers to the suitcase, the box that had the artifacts. They had no stickers like fragile, handled with care, and so there was no attention drawn to this box. And even then, the passengers kept asking questions, what is in the box? Are you carrying photographic equipment, or are these vaccines? And so the box was not kept in the hold, and you can see Corey there, it actually was kept in a seat beside him, and he didn't lose sight of it. At Eastern Airport in Cedar Rapids, the custom officials wanted to look into the box, but we were advised by Sarah Bucco, the head of collections. She said, if they want to look into the box, ask for secondary inspection, which we did. The ceremony in Benin was very simple and was a beautiful one. The king expressed gratitude for the return. Chants, praise songs, and dances were performed by court officials. My poem written in Cologne titled, I Have Come to Take You Home. A title derived from Diana Ferros's poem in tribute to Sarah Parkman in 1998, was performed by two ladies, Idao and Josephine Abbey. At some point, the king requested that the object be shown to his wives. They had earlier complained to him that they were yet to see any of the returning Benin objects. In response to the king's request, 3 officials drawn from the palace society accompanied us to the wives' quarters. And you can see the look on their faces, the absolute joy. The photographs taken here were by the Edo photographer Omorigi Osakolo for the Stanley Museum of Art, and became the most widely circulated images across global media outlets. So there are several controversies about, claims for Benin objects within Benin itself. Time will not permit me to go into this controversy and the several dimensions to it. However, amid this confusion, the Nigerian government clinically sorted things out by issuing the presidential declaration in the form of a gazette in 2023, recognizing the Oba of Benin as the custodian of all Benin objects, and asked that the king should work with any recognized national or international institution to ensure the preservation and security of these repatriated objects for the benefit of humanity. So the king set up a board of trustees and he signed an agreement with the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in February this year, in some agreements to manage the Benin objects and to ensure their preservation and visibility. This agreement also stipulates that these objects will be exhibited in national museums across the country and elsewhere with the king's express permission. The elaborate agreement demands the king's written consent in the management, sharing, and exhibition of Benin materials. The king is at liberty to call off the agreement if the commission is in breach of any provision contained therein. So what is the importance of restitution? It pertains a platform for healing and further engagement with communities, establishing lasting bonds between people and institutions. When restitution occurs, it is not only a physical return of objects, but also a return of people's stories, people's context, and agency. Museums should serve as spaces of transformative justice, and even though museums cannot restore the status quo, they can at least facilitate a transition from one unjust towards just relations. The Stanley Museum fulfills this need and has established a strong working relationship with the Benin Court, and by extension Nigeria, to open up further avenues for collaboration. So in conclusion, this restitution was satisfied at various levels. When in 2014 I exhibited terracotta heads in Benin, it was a symbolic return. A decade later, the Stanley Museum of Art has made it possible for me to take part in this historic event of physically taking the actual objects back to Benin. This could not have been possible without the visionary steps taken by Corey Gondak and Lauren Leslie, director of the museum, with the support of the Mellon Foundation. They have made it possible to tell a new narrative that places ethics and fairness at the heart of a new form of museology. Uwesi Kakabo, thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. sharing such moving stories and experiences around restitution, repatriation, museum ethics. Siraj and I have some questions for you. Please answer as you wish. And we have roughly 15 minutes for this discussion, and we'd like to open it up to our audience. And I'll lead with some questions I'd like to pose to you all. And my question to you is, how has your work with restitution and repatriation changed the way you think about the purpose and value of teaching museums in America today?
I'll go, if I may. I think that at academic museums, we have a responsibility to educate the campus community, as well as our next generation of museum professionals. At academic institutions, we're supposed to have difficult conversations and discuss challenging topics. And academic museums should be leading these discussions.
Well, at the very beginning, my relationship with these museums was very hard. They were very mad to deal with us. But it's gotten better over the years. It's become easier. It's nothing that I educated them with, but it's just that the old guard kind of faded away, and the new people have been willing to be educated, to learn about the law. But as Indian people, in my side, we have always had to know the law by the letter that the people were dealing with. We had to learn it real good, because that's what was expected of us.
Thanks. I'll just echo Cindy's sentiments that I think, it's as museums and teaching museums, it's our responsibility to bring in the next generation and mostly, be transparent in what our collections represent, especially their history, and just be upfront and not, of course, teach the law by the letter. For cities to know that, but I think there's a lot more to it than that as well. And just being open and welcome to giving you students those experiences.
Yes, exactly the same thing I would like to say about the impact on the community, and also as teachers who are using these subjects to teach, we also must think about the fact that they are not just academic resources, that the subjects have a vital force, they are embodiments of ancestors, they have a life outside of the museum, and that we must be thinking about letting the students that we teach know that there are people on the other side who may not be in the museum who have a lot of value for these objects, and I think, like you mentioned, transparency, respect, like we've shown in the case of the return to Benin, where all of the decisions came from the Palajan and from the Stanley Museum itself. So I think these are ways in which we can really be very impactful. The museum is a transformative space, and we have to put out captions that tell the true stories, the true histories of these objects, and not put out captions that are colored by the curator but definitely what the objects say and what they don't even say. I mean, must include all of that into the captions to tell the full story.
Two more questions to pose to you. Given the colonial history of the museum as an institution, what do you think its biggest opportunities are for change and growth?
Well, I think education of how and why these artifacts were gotten from these institutions. They have to look at themselves of where they got their artifacts, from what people. Some of these people were thieves, some of these were grave robbers. But because of their collection, they're held up to a high, as in very good people. Some of these people weren't that good. Especially some of those people collected from us. So they have to look at themselves and honestly look at the people who collected from them. I'm not saying they're bad people, but for us, nobody collected to save us. Nobody collected to say, I'm gonna collect these artifacts so someday the descendants will get them back and uplift their culture. They thought we were gonna be dead in 50 years. So they tried to collect as quick as they could, as many as they could. So they could tell our story once we're all dead. So museums have to look at themselves real good, honestly.
That's a really good dovetail to my answer to that question, because museums, institutions do need to be proactive in identifying the descendant communities and stakeholders that their collections represent, even though they might think they're not here anymore. Most collections have descendant communities that have a stake in those collections and that they're so important too. So I think just making sure that our museums and institutions have representation by the communities that they need to. And the biggest change is to actually, not just acknowledging that, but bringing those people to the table and discussing on how, what are the next steps for that collection. Really, taking to heart and taking into account how those descendant communities feel about us having those collections and whether we should or not. And I think that's the next biggest thing for change and growth is to be willing to give up, ownership and possession. NAGPRA talks about having possession or control of a collection, and I've often thought that that's, especially for human remains, I can't say that. Like, I don't have control, I don't have possession, they're not my ancestors, but that's the law, that's how they are seen by the law. So I think being able to acknowledge that, they are not our control and that control can be shared and it can be relinquished.
I like what Jonathan said about nobody collecting to save us. That makes me think about the stories and who's the storyteller. Is it the culture in which the items originated? Or is it the people who dug them up, traded them, bought and sold them? I like what you said. I think another opportunity that we have is to strive for more respectful collaboration with Indigenous communities, to incorporate more voices, not our voices, not the museum's voice, but the voice of the communities who are associated with the items that we have.
So incorporating the voices of the community and having collaborative programs or projects with these communities, I think that we must also think about how objects in the museum, in Western museums, can also move across geographical divide. Looking through object files in the museum, conducting research, you find that a lot of the objects are moved and been placed in really big exhibition within the United States. But those objects have not crossed the United States elsewhere. So I think in being transparent and being respectful and being considerate, we must think about how these objects can also go to these places, to the cultures that have been represented in these museums for several decades. And it's nice for us to see those objects on the other side.
Thank you so much. I can listen to you a very long time. And just following on from some of what all of you have said, and I'm also mindful of the different languages we use for these processes in different parts of the world. There's the use of repatriation that comes from Layiwola, and it's about sovereignty. On the African continent, we talk much more nowadays of restitution. And I suppose what I'm interested in wanting you to talk to us about, to think about, is how we can think about restitution and maybe even repatriation beyond the political, the diplomatic, the administrative, and the logistic work that it takes, as important as all of those things are. How can we hold onto a social emphasis in our understanding of the work of restitution?
I think it's clear that we need to remember that people are at the center of all of these issues. We need to move away from thinking about items, objects, as being detached from the culture and the heritage from which they came. I think we need to focus on community collaboration and multi-directional education. And shifting our view, as I said, of seeing collections as owned objects, but understanding them as ways to bridges to understanding culture. That's what museums do. They act as the interface between collections, cultural heritage communities, and the broader society.
When we get objects 3 ways: repatriation, which is very low, purchase either by a collector or auction, and donation. And I told my registrar, for the record, you can file the people that have owned this artifact. But outside of that, it has no previous owner. They have come home, and we're not gonna mention who owned it the last. So that's what we do when we display any artifact. We don't mention who owned it, because they just owned it. But it's from us. And we won't, even if they're very famous in the museum world, we don't mention those people when we display it or when we talk about it. because they are home. And we don't perform a ceremony when from a big object to a little bitty object comes home, but we do have a little bit silence to welcome it home. And we say, you must have had a journey. Tell us about your journey. Where have you been?
Yes, there are quite a number of hurdles, political hurdles, diplomatic, administrative, but I think that the buzzwords now are care, empathy, social justice, and I think that we should just put our eyes on the ball. I don't think there's any museum in North America that's not thinking about their collections, how to handle these collections that are problematic. So it is, for me, I don't think we should be bothered so much about the noise around us. Yes, there are difficulties, but we've made some progress, and I think we should not derail from that course.
So I would answer, kind of getting away from the politic, administrative, getting more social about repatriation. I think is just to be more social. So really build relationships, not just for repatriation. I always the perfect model for this, and I want to say repatriation is easy, but we have it easier because of the way that has been paved by everybody here in Iowa. And I think just, for institutions to have at least, an advisory council at that level, at larger levels, hold, tribal summits and really get people together on a regular basis. I think that's the best way to just build the foundation that you need to really work towards not just repatriation, but restitution.
And then finally, something that all of you have been alluding to and have already started talking about, and that is really in what ways are we really talking about a new understanding of what we mean by museum beyond merely the conventional functions of a museum, the way we think about what a museum is. And there's the idea of a cultural center, for example, which in some ways is sometimes used as a critique of what a museum does. So I suppose the question is about what opportunities there are for implementing a profoundly new way of understanding museums. How should these museums be staffed? How do we think about where the museum is and what we mean fundamentally by museum?
I think just going back to being more collaborative and inclusive in a museum or institution. It's probably easier said than done, but really diving deep into all your collections, histories, and figuring out which descendant communities, native or non-native, indigenous, or whatever country, nationality, needs to be contacted and brought into the conversation on how their heritage should be kept and displayed or not, and repatriated or not. So they just kind of building on that, collaborative approach, but really doing a deep dive into collections history to figure out how that should go.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Also, I think museums should adopt an attitude of stewardship and not ownership, and make space for more voices, whether it's on councils or exhibit development committees or public programming. to include more voices, share more stories.
Well, I don't know, I'm not an institution. But looking at museums, it's like, I'm sitting on the other side of the table. I'm looking across with people that have our things. And we want them back. And that's about the only thing I can say.
Just to add also that now we're dealing with more informed public. People come to the museum and they are looking to see how they are represented, okay, and they also want to see how the exhibitions are framed. There's so much knowledge about restitution and repatriation. People are becoming more and more aware that some of their treasures are kept somewhere. So I think it's important that museums should think about very creative ways in bringing in the voices, like you mentioned, of people who are represented in the museum. So I also think that there's a realization, like many museums, they now know that no matter how long a looted artifact is in the collection, the museum cannot lay claim to it, no matter how long it has stayed in there. So these are points that I want to make here.
I forgot to mention, but lately, last 10 years, we have been helping museums with their exhibit story, which is, because before that, they just had artifacts. But it seems like today, museums are coming more to us to help them tell their art story. And we're very glad to help. Because we see it as expanding ourselves. The more people know us, the better it is for us. Like we always see it. So we always help museums and some of these are bigger museums and some of these are little county museums. And we always help them when they come to ask how they should tell our story.
So I think we've timed this perfectly to transition to opening up the conversation with our audience. We have a catch box which you can freely toss around the room. It's heavily padded, so no one gets hurt, so have fun.
My name is Suzanne Buffalo. This is really cool. Need this for the house. Okay, I'm Jonathan's wife. I serve on the OSA Advisory Council and been involved in our tribal neighbor repatriation committee since it started. I would really like to question about museums. What do they need to do from here? What's the next step? And the problem with museums from a Native perspective is they think they know stuff that they don't. They have stuff that doesn't belong to them. They don't value their own staff, so why on earth would they value our staff and our time? The first steps museums should do is understand they don't have all of the information, much less the right information, of even what they hold. NAGPRA is an inventory. It's a conversation, yes, but it's an inventory. And what we have discovered in our investigation of museums is they don't know anything. They don't know what they have. I haven't met one single museum that has completed their inventory because what we would do when we would go visit, first visits, is Jonathan and his bunch would go see the stuff. And I would say, I wanna talk to the person who answers the phone when I call and I say, do you have any of our stuff? I wanna see the database. So I wanna go there and I wanna see what she or she are seeing. When I call up and I say, ring, this is Meskwaki Trek from Iowa. What have you got of ours? And the person is sitting there looking at me, who's not an anthropologist. They're not an archaeologist, they're a college intern. They don't know anything about they've never heard of the Meskwaki tribe before, which goes back to what Jonathan was saying. There's no file on us, no one prepares. No one goes, let's find out about these native people. Let's find out about this group of people. Before we come, we have to show up. We spend half of our time telling them who we are. So we just chewed up all the consultation time, all the staff time, all of our time. So what I would do is I would go into the basement usually, is where the computer is, where the college interns are. Nothing against college interns, you guys are making the world run. And we know that, because you're the one who crunches the numbers, who, a database is only as good as the information you put in it. If you don't put anything in it, if you don't have staff people to put anything in it, there's no information. So that's why nobody knows anything. So now an anchor comes and says you gotta do an inventory. So they plug people down there and I said, I'm calling from the Meskwaki tribe. And she said, okay, and she punched that in. She says, we got 3 things. I said, really? Okay, try this. Punch in sack and fox and see what comes up there. She punched in, she goes, oh my, there's like 50 things. I said, okay, let's go with fox. Let's go with Indians. Let's go with all the variation of Meskwaki. Now let's go with Renards, which is what the French called us. Let's go with Outagami, which is what some of the other Anishinaabe people call us. So I gave her 3 pages of what we've been called by other people, including German, British, French. Renards is French and fox. It means fox in French. So the British call us the fox. So a lot of our history that was collected back east, were identified as the Renards. The people in the museum don't know that. So when they would give us a list of our items, it was incomplete because they didn't query. They didn't ask the right questions. They didn't know who we were. They just said, here's the Meskwaki. Here's the sack and fox of the Mississippi Island. So I love the question, what do we do from here? Museums have never really known what they have. Even now, they don't know what's on loan, what's where they got it from. We need that introspection to happen now so the museums can figure out what are our goals today. We want to give up this mythology that we've been perpetuating so we can charge admission to pretend that we know something that we don't. And what we're hopeful for, what we're seeing, and I'm not saying NAGPRA did it, I think that old guard of we know best, we know what's important, thankfully that's falling away. And we have people who are saying, but how did we get that stuff? Do we have a right to have that? And that's that conversation. So if we're coming to talk to a museum and the person that we've been cultivating a relationship with, their funding stops. Because policies change for institutions. And that museum, they don't have enough money for college interns to go through all of that record. They don't have departments, they coalesce these departments. So now we're talking to a new director. Someone's retired. I mean, I think one of the things that museums can and should do is really get on the wagon, on the bandwagon of how are we gonna fund this intellectual research that really is what they're doing. And the tribes cannot fund that. There needs to be funding sources and support that comes from a lot of different areas. And we're fully in support of those resources being tapped into, whether it's federal, state, private foundations. It's gotta come from somewhere, but you gotta have the people. We're getting hurt now, because there's fewer museum people to do the work and have a conversation. Right now, that's our biggest barrier.
Thank you, everyone. My name's Faith, and I work here at the library, and I just want to thank you all for being here and sharing the stories and the journeys. It's very rewarding for me to sit here and hear how these items are being returned. And so for that, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's here. My question is, I heard one of you speak of future. I heard one say stewardship. We're talking a lot about collaboration and transparency. So my question is, what does the future look like for these items that are unidentified at this point? The last question touched on some of that, but I'm just curious, like, what does that look like for each one of you who is working on a special project? How do you move forward? Where do you go from here?
So for, I guess, collections and institutions that, are uncertain of what they have, don't know what they have, I guess from my side of this whole conversation, I can speak to it from the NAGPRA side of things, and just speak to the new regulations that are coming out, where it is definitely kind of tightening down on what institutions need to do, as well as better defining what an institution is. So any institution is, by definition in NAGPRA, receives federal funds. And that can be, of course, colleges, universities, but also local and government level, even state level institutions or agencies that in any way have some federal funding overhead are technically beholden to NAGPRA too. So that means like sheriff's offices even, county medical examiner's offices, libraries, who are federally funded, who may have items and collections that fall under NAGPRA. So I think it's definitely a better mandate now from NAGPRA. But again, I guess, you can't know what you have unless you really get to a deep dive into your inventories and really get a good database if there's not one going, and really do a deep dive into everything.
I definitely think that there's willingness and understanding of what needs to be done, but unfortunately, a lot of resources are required in order to do those things. So I had an intern at one point in the last 10 years who typed the words "pot from mound in Arkansas" into my database, but I didn't become aware that I had a pot from a mound in Arkansas until I read it with my own eyes while I was looking at the bird that was underneath it. So unfortunately, we know what direction we need to go, but we need more funding in order to get there.
Well, the future, I hope we see
what does the future look like? I think we're going to have more and more museums put out their collection digitally, which is very important. That is so useful for getting to know what is in the storage of many of the museums. It's very difficult to also say, to project, to know what's going to happen. Just down about 5 to 10 years ago, nobody was talking about restitution of British bronzes. But now we can see a lot of them, a lot of museums showing what they have in their collection. It was very difficult for you to even access them before. If you show any interest in a hidden object in the museum, once you ask for it, they put it into hiding. But now it's now available digitally, which is really very good. I also see a situation where collections elsewhere on the continent in Africa want to be digitalized so that people can also access them from here as well. So I see that as a very positive way in which museums are getting future ready.
Can I ask Corey a question to you? You started off by saying that the historic land acknowledgement is no longer an opening part of ceremonies like this one. We're all here because we're interested in the topic of repatriation, and it seems that there are people in positions of power now more interested in repatriating people than cultural patrimony. And wondered if this is going to change the zeitgeist of the growing favoritism towards repatriation, if this is going to stop it, much like the sort of the stopping of the historic land acknowledgement statement. Much of what you've said has been kind of technical and optimistic, but I'm worried about calling that sheriff's office or that county museum and saying, we don't have to talk to you, and people hanging up. Are we seeing a new zeitgeist arriving in the last 100 days that will make your jobs more difficult in a broader societal context?
My answer is yes. I agree with you. I think that the current climate brings with it some challenges that we have not seen that are either administrative, logistic, financial, or intellectual. So personally, my response to your question is yes, I do see a negative impact on the shift towards returning people and how that impacts what we're doing with these objects. I called attention to the absence of that acknowledgement with this question in mind that you just asked. So I appreciate that. So thank you. I wish we had more time. We have, I think, less than a minute, and I know that the doors close sharply at 8 o'clock because of staff needs in the space. I want to thank you all for being here tonight, and please give a round of applause for them.